Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Census Data Seminar for Victoria. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands that we're meeting on today. And for me here in Sydney, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to this city and this region, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining this seminar today. So we'll do some quick introductions. My name's Mark Harding and I'm the Program Manager for the 2021 Census Data Operations. And joining me today is Caroline Deans, the Director for 2021 Census Dissemination.
Good morning, everyone.
So a recording of this session, along with the slide deck that we're using, will be available from the ABS website in the near future. What are we covering today? Well, we'll be talking just a bit of context about the 2021 census and the times that we conducted the census in with the pandemic and yes, the unusual situations that presented. We'll be talking about the quality of the census and response rates. We'll obviously be talking a lot about the data. That's what we'll be focusing on most. And then we'll give a bit of information at the end about our release timeline from here, accessing the data, and we'll have some time for questions. Speaking of questions, the way we're going to be doing that through this virtual session is using the website PollEV. So you can see that link on your screen now, and encourage you to jump on and log into pollev.com and use that 2021 Census VSDS to get in and be able to log your questions. And we've got plenty of time at the end for that. And that link will appear on each of the slides as we go through, so you won't lose it. So we do like to start a lot of our census presentations with a bit of a reminder of the size and scale and what we do in the census. It's an enormous logistical operation to ensure that all 65 of the census questions are asked of every person in Australia, and it takes approximately 35,000 field staff travelling a total of around 10 million kilometres. We mailed out almost 14 million items to around 11 million households and answered over 600,000 calls from the public. And of course, in 2021, we undertook the census during, well, I don't know if we say the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was certainly a very significant thing going on at the time, but it seems like we're back into high COVID numbers again now. So maybe we're still experiencing the height of the COVID pandemic. But let's talk a little bit about COVID and the census and what we did and how it impacted us. So the census was definitely different from other censuses. Census night was in August last year, and that was at a time when approximately half of the country was in lockdown around census night. External borders were closed, and in fact, I think Victoria at the time was in lockdown on census night, and much of Melbourne had been locked down in the month leading up to census night. And that all certainly created some challenges for conducting the census. For example, we had to move to a more virtual approach for training our field staff, and there were travel restrictions in place between states and territories and even within some states and territories. So moving field staff around the country and to remote communities was much more challenging. The ABS had a COVID safe plan, which we put in place, and it detailed how we would deliver the census, manage our staff in the field, and keep the community safe in line with government health orders. And as much as a worldwide pandemic is definitely a terrible thing, there were actually some positives from a census perspective in how the pandemic played out. So with half of Australia in lockdown, it actually gave people, we think, more opportunity around the country to log in and complete their census both online or just complete their census at all. And that added to our high response rate, which we'll get to in a moment. And with more people staying at home rather than travelling around the country, we could really see a more complete picture of Australian households and Australian families because people were together in the same house, filling out all the data on the same form. And not only that, but with less overseas travellers, more Australians returning home, we got a more complete picture of the population with all the rich census data that goes along with that in this census. So those were all some positives. And the data obviously does provide a unique picture of Australia over the past 5 years. And significantly during the COVID-19 pandemic, we get to see, where we were, what we were doing, and all of those insights from the data. And we can see COVID insights in the data. International visitors dropped as expected. And as I said, we saw a decrease in the number of people away from their residence, so more people at home. And in states that were open for travel, the Northern Territory and Western Australia, we did see a major uplift in visitors from out of state. So Western Australia had a 10% increase, for example, in how many people were travelling interstate to Western Australia since the last census. So the data was reviewed by an independent assurance panel, including consideration of the COVID impacts. And the panel found that the data is fit for purpose and consistent in quality with previous censuses. And while this was a unique time, we are very happy to say the data is of very high quality and a true snapshot of Australia. But don't necessarily take my word or even the panel's word for it. Let's look at the metrics and some of the quality indicators. So despite the challenges that lockdowns posed, we achieved a 96.1% dwelling response rate in the 2021 census, which is an excellent response. It's up about 1% from 2016. So we did get that great coverage. And the net undercount, which is a net position that considers all the people that we potentially missed but should have been counted in the census, and all the people that the census somehow counted more than once, and it provides that net position. And we ended up at 0.7%, which is actually the lowest undercount that we've had on record for an Australian census. So that is an excellent result. And as expected, most people completed online. That went up quite a lot. We think the pandemic probably contributed to that as well. So 78.8% or 9%, I should say, on online, and that leaves just over 20% who did it on paper. And for Victoria, we can see that was even higher at pretty much 80% of online responses. And we do see that the response rate and the net undercount both being better for Victoria. So even though it's a wonderful outcome for all of Australia, it's a very, very high quality snapshot of Victoria as well. So that is all of the intro and that I wanted to get to, and get to the data as quickly as we could. We do have time for questions, so if people do have specific questions around how we conducted the census and what the pandemic means, very happy to talk about that and take questions on that in census time. But we want to get into the data, and we collect census data on people, households, families and dwellings across Australia. So we're going to start with people and talk about some people stats. And it's good to give a high level first to really understand the overall picture. So you may have seen this slide already if you've logged into any of our other seminars or our launch, but I will quickly go over just the set the scene, if you will. We counted 25.4 million people across Australia in the 2021 census, and the population of Australia grew 8.6% in the 5 years from 2016. So the ACT again experienced the greatest population growth, and Victoria was second to that at almost 10% growth from 2016, and then Queensland very close after. But we will zoom in on Victoria, and that's going to be our focus today, of course. So Victoria grew from 5.9 million people to 6.5 million. That's a 10% increase, and you can see the increases from the past few censuses. We counted about 5.3 million in 2011, and so it was an increase of just over 10% to 2016 and 8.5% from 2011 to 2016. So we have seen those significant increases in Victoria over the last number of censuses and above the overall Australian increase. And Victoria now makes up just over 25% of the Australian population, which is actually proportionately slightly less than we saw 50 years ago. So if we look at that 1971 figure at the bottom, Victoria was about nearly 28% of the Australian population, so slightly less share of the whole Australian population. But just like Australia, which has actually more than doubled in the last 50 years, Victoria very nearly has doubled in the last 50 years since 1971 in terms of population. So let's have a look at a bit more of a zoomed in picture. We can see that this map, let me explain the map first. It shows on the left our change in population since 2016, and on the right, a change in dwellings, and where there is, it's by SA3, so statistical area 3s. And we can see from this that it's quite an even picture of growth in Victoria compared with the states, say New South Wales, where we do see some declines in some areas and growth in other areas. There's no declining areas across Victoria. They would be shown in blue or green kind of colour, teal sort of colour. But we can see growth right across regional Victoria, all less than 20% population growth, but quite evenly distributed, and changes in dwellings are mostly in the 0 to 10% range, especially as you move away from Melbourne. If we move in a little bit closer and see the, sorry, my light just turned off here, so I'm just going to get that back on. I'm not sure why we do pay for the electricity bill, but let's keep going. So if we move in and have a look at Melbourne, we can see that both population and dwelling growth in the north and west is higher, such as Wyndham and Melton Bacchus Marsh, Tullamarine and Broadmeadows, and the outer east there with Cardinia and Casey, and similar patterns for the dwelling growth. So yeah, what else do I want to say about this? No, again, no areas of decline, all growth, and reasonably evenly distributed. So that is quite different to what we would see in some of the other states. So yeah, interesting. But I think right now I'm going to pass over to Caroline, who's going to continue on with more data on people. Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you, Mark. And yes, I'm going to continue that people story. First, I do wish to acknowledge the lands of the traditional owners on which we are meeting. And I'm joining you today from Canberra, which is Ngunnawal people. So I wish to pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Let me start with a population pyramid, a very typical way of presenting the age and sex distribution of an area in this one simple graph. So if you haven't seen one of these before, let me tell you what this shows. This is data for Victoria from 2001. On the left side here, you can see males, and each bar represent the proportion of males in that age category, starting from 0 to 4, 5 to 9, all the way up in 5-year groups to 85 plus. And the same thing for females on the right-hand side. And on the males, we can see that the largest bars, the greatest groups represented in the Victorian population in 2001 is in the groups between the ages of 30 and 44, and the same for females, each representing just under 4% of the population. The median age back in 2001 of Victorians was 35, which was the same as the Australian median. So what's the picture now in 2021? Let me add in some teal bars. You'll see that shape has shifted a little bit. If we look now at the most common age groups for males, it's slightly younger. We're looking there at the 25 through to 39-year-olds, and females more in that 30 to 39 age cohort. But if you look a little bit more closely, what is quite interesting here is the shrinking of population in sort of the teenage years and children's, and also growth from about the age of 60 upwards, both for males and females. The median age now for Victorians in 2021 was 38. Again, that is the same as the Australian median. Everyone is getting older. Now, you might have noticed that I've only been talking about male and female. And if you recall, when you filled in your own census form, there are actually 3 response categories for the sex question in the 2021 census. There was male, female, and non-binary sex. what we are talking about in most of our census data releases are male and female data only. We're going to release an analytical piece later this year that will drill down into some of the responses we receive for that non-binary sex category. And we did have people write in responses and they were able to multi-mark with a male or a female response. So we're going to do a full analysis of people who responded with non-binary sex in a later article, but for the purposes of most of the data that we release from the census, it's all expressed as male and female. And we've gone through a random imputation process for people who did respond with non-binary sex to allocate them a binary sex variable of male and female. And I will just say that the purpose of that was to minimise misinterpretation of the data. There's been a lot of interest in this question, and we have put a piece up on our website to explain what this question represents and what it doesn't represent more importantly. So if you are interested in this at all, I really encourage you to read the piece that we've got on non-binary sex to understand what was meant by that question and what's to come in the future with our data for non-binary sex. Let's move on now to talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Victoria. And the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples increased by 37.4% in Victoria. That was a rate of increase greater than we saw across Australia. The Australian increase was about 25%, and it's a rate of increase that is greater than between the last two censuses. So in 2021, we saw just over 65,000 people identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander in Victoria, and that represents about 1% of the total population. Contrast that with 10 years ago in 2011, when there were nearly 38,000 people identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and that represented 0.7% of the Victorian population. The census also captures a lot of information about the cultural diversity of our population, and I'm going to share a few variables with you, a few data observations. There are many more in the census if you go online and check it out for yourself, but let me start with a measure of the diversity of the state in terms of where we are born. And to explain this pie chart, we're talking about first generation, second generation, and third generation Victorians. First generation, 31.7%, are those who were born overseas. The second generation Victorians, 23.9%, are those who had at least one parent born overseas. And then the third plus generation, that 44%, are those who were neither born overseas nor had a parent born overseas. And what we see, if we were to compare this to our Australia chart, in Australia it's more half-half between the first and second and the third plus generation. But you can see here quite clearly that there is more diversity in country of birth in Victorians. So what countries are we all coming from? Most people in Victoria continue to be born in Australia, just under the 2/3 there. But now the second biggest country of birth for Victorians is India. And that's jumped up in the last 5 years to the 2021 census. That's now representing 4% of the Victorian population were born in India. And then following on from that, England, China, New Zealand, and Vietnam make up the next 4 countries, other than Australia, in which people were born. Like Mark did, I'm going to drill down into what that looks like by SA3, and then I'll zoom in on Melbourne. This map again of Victoria shows, if I just look at the regions now, that lighter colour shows that the proportion of people who were born overseas was less than 13%, slightly darker peach colour up at Mildura at 13.6%, and we can also see it's a bit darker around Geelong and Shepparton. Geelong was the highest area outside of the greater metro area for overseas born, which was still 18.7%, relatively low compared to what we will now see when I move forward into Melbourne. Much darker colours there. So really different story when we look at the cultural makeup of people who live in Melbourne compared to live in regional Victoria. So the highest region here is Dandenong, and that's actually 56% of people living in the Dandenong SA3 were born overseas, followed closely by Melbourne. And then other areas of interest there are in the west. We've got Brimbank, Wyndham, and up to Tullamarine and Broadmeadows, all in the 40s. And then over in the east, that band from Manningham, Whitehorse and Monash, all really dark areas, more than 42% born overseas. And the countries of birth do actually change as we drill into each of those areas. So for example, in Dandenong, it's Vietnamese and India. In Melbourne, it's China and India. And then when we go out to Tullamarine, it's Indian and Iraq. And so what we can see in census data is not just that spread of how many people are born overseas or in Australia, but where they came from. Let's look now, very interesting graph that shows us some of the impacts of COVID on population arrivals in Victorian. This is just looking over the last 5 years, and we've colour-coded pre-pandemic and post-pandemic or mid-pandemic. And so those first 4 bars show the people who are currently living, who were born overseas and arrived in Australia in 2016, 2017, 2018 and 2019. And you can see the numbers growing from about 73,000 in 2016 up to nearly 100,000 people from overseas arrived in 2019. Interestingly, the population of Australia was also growing or increasing with people coming from overseas. So as a percentage of people arriving in Australia, Victoria stayed constantly at 30% for each of those years, 2019 and prior. Then 2020, we can see that there were about 35,000 people moved to Victoria from overseas. Presumably quite a few of them came before the pandemic in the first couple of months of 2020. And then in 2021, that figure represents just until August, the 10th of August, because that's when we conducted the census. So 2021, we just saw 10,800 people arrive from overseas into Victoria. And I guess reflecting what was happening with lockdowns and border controls, the proportion of the overall people coming into Australia actually decreased a bit. The Victorian share of that decreased to 27.8 and 28. So just below that 30% share that it had been tracking at for the 4 years prior. Another aspect of cultural diversity that we look at is what languages do people speak? And here we're looking at a 30-year time frame back to 1991 and comparing that with 2021. And so in 1991, about 78% of people, so just under 80%, spoke only English at home. And those who did speak a language other than English at home were predominantly Italian and Greek, and then you can see there a small share of Cantonese, Vietnamese, Arabic, including Lebanese. Fast forward 30 years and the percentage speaking only English at home dropped. So it's dropped down to 67%, and there's quite a different makeup of the languages that are used by people at home. And so Mandarin is now the most common language used at home other than English of Victorians. Vietnamese has jumped up there, Greek's dropped, Punjabi has entered, as you would expect when I say that the most common country of birth is India, and the Italians dropped from 4.2% in 91 right down to 1.4% in 2021. The final story that I will tell on diversity is about religious affiliation. And I'm starting here with a slide showing a national picture, a very simple national picture that groups all the religions of a Christian denomination are all included in that orange bar. And then the dark teal bar is people who say no religion or express a secular or another spiritual belief. And you can see they just about met in 2021, and there's been a steady decrease in the proportion of people reporting an affiliation with Christian religions, and an increase, particularly in the last couple of censuses, with people reporting no religious affiliation. And the bar down the bottom there is all the other religions joined together. Let me go into more detail and show you the Victorian picture. And here we have separated out the different Christian denominations. The bar at the top there is the dark orange line is Catholic, so it continues to be the most commonly reported Christian religious affiliation, but has dropped off in the last 10 years in particular. Running almost parallel with that are other Christians, and then the Anglican group has dropped right down to just over 5%. And you can see there the no religion is the same line I presented before, but the Victorian picture, and that's coming up to just about 40% of Victorians in 2021 express no religious affiliation. And clumped down the bottom, we've got a few different religions, a little bit hard to see, but Islam is growing. Hinduism is also growing. And Buddhism is a little bit flatter, but interestingly, Victoria is the state that has the highest proportion of people who report a religious affiliation with Buddhism, and that is 3.1%. I'm now going to pass back to Mark, and he's going to take us through a couple of the new topics that appeared on this census.
Thank you very much, Caroline. It is a great pleasure to talk about some of the new topics. It's the first time we've had some new significant new topics on the census for over a decade, at least 3 or 4 censuses, I think it was. And so the first one that I'll talk about is long-term health conditions. This was a question. It's good to give a bit of context to this. It was a single question, and you can see that question on this slide. We presented 10 selected health conditions, and these were chosen based on outcomes of stakeholder consultation, as well as how common these conditions are, and also their importance in terms of data collected being able to be used to inform services and policy and research. So asking a question like this on the census to households gives us a really good set of data, but it's not as comprehensive as other health surveys that we run in the ABS. It's just the single question in this, and whereas we go into more detail and break down more about different conditions and health aspects in our health surveys. But what this does allow, and the real power of the census is asking this question, allows it to be cross-classified with other variables in the census, and it provides the data on these conditions in this way for the entire population. And the real, one of the things that's really powerful about the census, as most people know, is that it allows you to drill down into those smaller population groups, so smaller age cohorts, small geographic areas, and people who have higher or lower proficiency in English, things like that, that we can see and get this health data alongside. So we have released a conceptual article on this, and that's on our website, and it's just there to help you understand the data collection methods and the strengths and the limitations of the census health data compared to other sources. And so would encourage you to check that out if this is a variable that you're going to be using for your research or decision making. So one other thing that's just interesting to note from this, we ask one question on the form, we get that answer from everybody, but it creates around 30 variables in our, I think exactly 30 variables in our outputs. So counts of each condition, obviously, counts of some of the defined comorbidities like asthma and lung condition or diabetes and heart disease. And also we add in variables that are the number of conditions that a person has. And so, yeah, we do extract a whole lot of information and share that from this question. Enough about the question. Let's start talking about the data related to the question. So nearly 1.8 million people usually resident in Victoria reported having at least one of the selected long-term health conditions. So that's nearly 30% of Victorians. Very similar to the Australian rate. It's under 30%, but very similar. In Australia, it was 27.7 and 27.4 in Victoria. So you can see that 1.2 million had reported one health condition, 372,000, two of the health conditions, and then 186,000 with three or more health conditions. So to explain what this one is, we're looking at through the age years along the bottom, and then the percentage of the Victorian population who reported each of these conditions. And so we're seeing how those conditions increase in terms of a proportion of the Victorian population or decrease through the ages. So I'll just go into this in a little bit of detail and spend a little bit of time discussing. So the arthritis is the orange line that you can see that comes out at the top. Now, overall, 8% of the Victorian population reported being diagnosed with arthritis, but here we can see how dramatically the rate increases with age. And as you would expect across all of the health conditions, as well as, and when we cross-classify that with other populations and everything, age is a huge influence on the outcomes. So it's a really important thing to remember when you're looking at drilling into those smaller population groups, whether you're looking by different cultural backgrounds or different, any other aspect, you first do want to check, what is the age of the population and how much would that be influencing the health conditions here. So yeah, arthritis is the orange line, and then we've got asthma, which is that yellow line. It's often thought of as a condition for young people, and indeed it is the highest in up till about 10 years old. We can see it's the highest condition reported for people that age, but you can see that it very much stays consistent through life. So it's still being reported and later in life, and it just starts to decline at the end there at around 80 to 100 years. Diabetes is the dark green line, and we can see that it's also has a later life peak, but we do see people in their 30s and 40s reporting diabetes, and it growing, from there. It's very similar. This line here is very similar to the national picture. Similarly, heart disease, which is the purple line, peaks later in life, and it's similar to arthritis, but just not as prevalent. And we see that very similar in the national picture as well. And mental health, which is certainly an interesting one that we've collected data on, and that's in the light blue. It's the highest reported condition for all groups from 20 to 50. And the reporting in the age groups 80 years and higher is in Victoria is actually higher than the national average. And you can see that uptick as it goes through those years. We don't know exactly why, but there certainly were some interesting circumstances around aged care and the pandemic and lockdown potential related anxiety of people in nursing homes and retirement villages, possibly a lack of being able to visit loved ones at those times, and so there's certainly some things that could be looked into there and considered as to why Victoria has had a higher mental health reporting in the census for those age groups than the rest of the country. I'll keep moving on, and this is quite an angry looking map, but it's showing the proportion that reporting mental health condition across Victoria, and it's all this whole thing is representing between 0 and 14%, although we don't really have any of the very light color there, so it's very much showing that there is a proportionately high reporting of mental health in that more between the 5 to 14%, 7 to 14% ranges. You can see it's essentially above 5% everywhere. It's higher in Latrobe Valley at 12.2%, Bendigo 13%, and Ballarat and Maryborough at around 13% as well. So looking at Melbourne, and it is a little bit of a different picture, but somewhat similar across the SA3s here. It's high in the outer suburbs. Frankston is nearly 12% and Sunbury 11%. And you've also got those points in the inner north areas of Brunswick, Coburg, above 13% there, Darebin over 12%, and the Yarra at just about 12%. And that's potentially due to there being higher proportions of young people, students in these areas. And we did see, as I said, mental health being the highest reported condition in the sort of 20 to 50-year-old age brackets. So moving on to the other new question that we had in the census this time, and another one that I'm personally quite excited about. We've only got the one slide on it here today, but we'll give you the overall results. But we did ask people about their service in the Australian Defence Force. This is what we saw. Now, we asked people about their current and previous service in the Australian Defence Force, and the summary results, we had 2% of the Victorian population aged 15 years and over have served in the Australian Defence Force, and just almost 11,000 people reported currently serving, and nearly 95,000 people previously serving. So this is the first time we've had this sort of data and insight into the veteran community, not only in terms of just the counts and understanding that service population and where people are living and would be accessing services, but also mixed with all the other insights that we get from the census data. We can get a really rich picture of our veteran communities. So the total ever served population in Victoria being just over 100,000 people, and that's 2%. That 2% compares nationally with 2.8% across Australia. So about 3% of the whole Australian population have ever served, and it's 2% in Victoria, a bit lower. All right, so we've been talking a lot about people, but now we're going to move on to households and families. And let's get into it first by talking about households. We have three categories of households in the census. We either see people as a family household, a lone household, or a group household. Most people in Victoria live in family households. Well, that's true for Australia too, but 1/4 of the households were lone person, just nearly 26%. And in the last 30 years, we've actually seen an increase in the number of lone person households and a decrease in family households. So back in 1991, lone person households made up only about 1 in 5 at 20% of Victoria, with family households more like 3/4, 75%, and the group households fairly similar, around 4.5%. So the 2021 results for Victoria are actually quite similar to Australia. We definitely saw around 4% group households, just slightly less, but still very much in the 25% for lone households, and right on around 70% for family households. So it's a very similar result to what we've seen in the national picture. But families, which is, in some ways we identify a bit more with families than with households, so maybe a little more interesting to reflect on. But in terms of families, the most common family type in Victoria continues to be couple with children, although this has continued to decrease. It was more than 50% 25 years ago in 96, and it's been coming down. So now at 45%, and that's predominantly come off the couples with, added onto the couples with no children, which was at 32.6% 25 years ago, and has gone up to nearly getting closer to 40% now. The lone parent families has increased slightly from 14% to 15% over that same time. We do collect information on same-sex couples in the census, but note that it's where those couples are living together and filling out the census on the same form. So there were 21,331 same-sex couples in Victoria, and it represents 27% of all same-sex couples in Australia. So slightly above the state's proportion of the population, as I said earlier, was about 25.6%. So we can see here that all of the states and married couples made up about 30% of all same-sex couples. In Victoria, it was 28.4%, so under. So it was more like 30.5% across Australia, but 28.4% in Victoria, so a bit lower and lower than any other state or territory, and that could be a COVID effect with the longer lockdowns and other COVID restrictions experienced in Victoria. It's possible more people were holding off to have their wedding with in the presence of family and friends and enjoy the party, and didn't actually get married. But again, something to consider. Yeah, so it's slightly lower in Victoria. And if we look at the same-sex couples, this slide just shows the increase in same-sex couples over the past censuses, and 2021 showing that to over 21,000 in Victoria, and that's a 70% increase on 2016. So we've seen a much bigger increase there than you can see between 2011 and 2016. So an interesting curve, I guess, as we look across the fairly steady reporting for a number of censuses, increases for a number of censuses, and then getting a bit more, rapid increase up to 2021 there. So that's what I wanted to talk to about families, and now I'll hand over to Caroline again to move us on. Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you, Mark. Now we're moving from families on into the dwellings in which people live. Always an interesting topic of conversation. Let's start with tenure types. So how do we pay for the dwellings in which we live? Noting that these are private dwellings only, and these are Victoria figures here. 36.1% of Victorians are living in a house that they own, but they've still got a mortgage on that dwelling. 32.2 are fortunate enough to own their home outright, and 28.5% are renting. And the figures are actually surprisingly a little bit different to the Australian average. In Australia, there are fewer people owning outright and more people renting, and pretty much the same that own it with a mortgage. But let's have a look at that over time. And what I've got on this graph is back to 1996. And we've got here dwelling numbers. So we're not showing proportions on this graph, we're showing dwelling numbers. And that dark orange bar, if you look at the left of the screen in 1996, is just under 700,000. That was 700,000 dwellings were owned outright in 1996. Fast forward 20 years and there's a slight decrease, but still around about 700,000 dwellings were owned outright. In 96, very few were owned with a mortgage and fewer still rented. If we then jump to 2021, what we can see is an increase in all the tenure types, but a jump closer to 800,000 for the first time in dwellings that are owned outright, but have been really overtaken by the number of dwellings with a mortgage. And also you can see the number of dwellings that are rented in Victoria has also grown quite a lot in the last 5 years. A topic of commentary in the press has been unoccupied dwellings. So I thought it'd be useful to show how has that in fact changed over time. And in this graph, now presenting it back to a percentage, because I want to compare Victoria to Australia as a whole. So again, left of the screen is 1996 through to 2016 in the middle, and right of the screen is 2021. And in Victoria on census night last year, there were about 300,000 unoccupied dwellings, and that represented about 10.6 of all private dwellings, which is much higher than the national proportion, which is more like 9.6, but is quite a bit down on the proportion of dwellings that were unoccupied in 2016. So it's worth considering, what do we mean by unoccupied dwellings? They're not necessarily dwellings that are ready for people to move into right away. They can be dwellings that were just unoccupied for the night of census night. It could be a situation where people have a holiday home on the coast, and their holiday home down at Lorne was unoccupied, but they were back in Melbourne and their dwelling in Melbourne was occupied. It can also be dwellings under construction or just about ready to be occupied, but people haven't quite moved in yet. So that contributes to those number of unoccupied dwellings. And they can be dwellings that are available, that are unoccupied, ready for new tenants to move into. So I think it is worth clarifying just what unoccupied dwellings do mean. Let's look at the type of dwellings in which we live. And here we're comparing Melbourne to the rest of Victoria for a dwelling structure. And we describe dwellings as separate houses. That dark teal colour there are separate houses, and they represent the biggest proportion back in 2001 and continue to be the biggest proportion in 2021. And if I look at in 2021, about 65% of Melbournians lived in a separate house, which compared to nearly 90% across the rest of Victoria. And that proportion for the rest of Victoria is pretty much the same as it was 20 years ago. And what else has changed in the last 20 years is we're seeing an increased proportion of people living in semi-detached and townhouses. In Melbourne in particular, a real growth in those larger apartment blocks, so apartment blocks that are 4 or more story. And I've now got just one final slide on income and housing costs and looking at how that has changed over time. So we do collect reported income data on the census. Mark was talking earlier about the health survey, the health question, and how it doesn't compare in terms of being comprehensive compared to something like the National Health Survey. Likewise, this income question is a single question, and we'll just ask how much did you, what was your average income, and people can report on a weekly basis or an annual basis. So nowhere near as comprehensive as how we collect income through other sources, for example, our survey of income and housing. But it is comparable to the way we collected income 5 years ago and in previous censuses. So the top figure I'm looking at there is household income. So of all the people who are earning an income in the household, just adding that up. That one hasn't been equivalised, just straight adding up of all income earners aged over 15 in the household. And you can see the Victorian numbers have gone up by 24%. For comparison, the rate of inflation was about 9.5% between 2016 and 2021. So household income has gone up at more than twice the rate of inflation. Personal income, so how much each individual reported, has also gone up about that 24% and is now at 803 is the median total personal income, which is very similar to the Australia level, which I think was 805. So very similar figures in Victoria to the Australia. And then we look at two measures of housing costs, rent or mortgage. Rent is measured on a weekly basis, and here we've got the median rent in Victoria has gone up 13.8% in the last 5 years, and that's an increase at a rate greater than the Australian increase. It's now sitting at about $370 as the median weekly rent. And the final row in that table is mortgage repayments. These are monthly mortgage repayments, gone up 7.6%, so much smaller growth. And it's really worth pointing out, if you're planning on using any of the housing cost data from the census, that we ask a single question again on housing costs, and that is for the mortgage, that is how much people are paying off their mortgage. So how much did you pay on your mortgage? And so for many people, that might be the minimum balance required, but for many others, they may be paying more off, particularly as we've had, or certainly at the time of the census, we had lower interest rates. So there may have been people paying more than their minimum monthly requirements. So be cautious when using that mortgage repayment figure. It comes with a lot of caveats. That is all the data we're going to talk about today, but I will put up a slide here that just shows the breadth of data that is collected on the census. We didn't talk about everything today that was released on the 28th of June in the first release. There was also some information on volunteering, unpaid work and care, transport, and we didn't touch on those at all. There's more on education and training, for example. Our next major data release is coming out in October, and that's where I think we're going to see some really interesting insights into how COVID has impacted how we were living in August 21. So we'll have a lot more information about labour force, people's employment situation. That includes the number of hours they were working, industries and occupations that they were working in, and how has that changed over time, and how does the Victorian data compare to other states. We also have some more education data, so we're talking about non-school qualifications, and then we've got some other method of travel to work. Did you get to work on Census Day? Did you go to work on Census Day? Did you work from home? I think that's going to show some really interesting data, and I'm particularly looking forward to how that might compare when we look at Victoria compared to other states, or even within the state or across different occupations. And another figure that we expect to have quite a COVID impact is what we refer to as internal migration. And that is, where did you live a year ago and where did you live 5 years ago? So in October, we'll get to see that data will come out, and we will be doing seminars in October or November to share that data with everyone. And then it still keeps going into 2023. We continue to release some of the more complex data sets. So the socioeconomic index for areas, you might know, CEFA. We're doing estimates of homelessness and some other data releases that you can see into 2023. And we've mentioned a couple of times during our presentation today, we've referred to different analytical articles that we've written, and we'll continue to release those. We've got quite a few already available on the website, and we'll continue to release those in the coming months. We've still got some first release articles coming out. We've got a good one on cultural diversity that will be coming out next month, I think, and also one on health that will be coming out next month. And then a lot of articles as we move into second release. But if you want to do your own analysis, I've just got some screen snips there. Many of you may be quite familiar with our website, but if you're not familiar and you want to do your own digging, here's a couple of useful ways to get into the data. We've got a page called Find Census Data, and from that page you can either search by topic, which is that screenshot you can see in the middle, or you can search by area. So the topics, for example, if you clicked on that cultural diversity topic, that would give you an overview of many of the measures of cultural diversity that I spoke about. There'll be a data cube associated with that, and then any articles related to cultural diversity, including a really interesting that we've written on religious affiliation. You'll find that in cultural diversity. But if you want to look at your area first rather than the topic, and you can use our search by census data by area tool. And this is an amazing tool that allows you to search by any number of geographical type areas that you can imagine. So you can find data for your suburb, for your postcode, for your local government area, for your state, and then all the ABS geographies as well, SA1, SA2, SA3, and electoral districts. So that tool there lets you get into the data for the area that you are interested in. I will briefly mention Table Builder. So many of you may be users of Table Builder and know that we haven't been able to release that yet with 2021 census data. This is a tool that allows you to build your own tables. So rather than doing our pre-constructed ones, it allows you to drop in rows and columns to construct the tables that you're interested in for the areas that you are interested in. So unfortunately, the 2021 census data isn't available yet. We are hoping to make that available by second release, and we are sending out regular updates to registered Table Builder users. Our next update is due later this week, and we will also be posting updates on our website. So look out for that to hear what is happening with Table Builder. I think this is my final slide, the Census Dictionary. If you want to know more about any of the variables we've talked about, you want to understand the data before you analyse it, we have got this wonderful tool called the Census Dictionary that lists every variable. Mark said earlier in the health topic that we create 30 variables from one question, and this variables index shows you all the variables that we collect. And for each of them, when you click through, it defines the variable. It talks about the scope, that is, was it the question asked of all people or just people aged over 15, or is there a different scope again? What are the different categories that the data is output in? Snips of the questions that were asked to form that variable, and how the variable is actually created, how it's changed over time, because sometimes there are changes in the way questions are asked, and we summarise that, and other data use considerations, including the item non-response rate, so the proportion of people who didn't respond to a particular question. So I do encourage you to use the Census Dictionary to find out more about the variables as you're about to do any of your own analysis. And now I'm going to hand back to Beck, who's going to lead us through, not hand back to Beck, I'm going to introduce Rebecca Roberts, who's going to take us through the questions. And, oh, sorry, I'll let you remind them of the address.
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. Great presentation. Thank you, Mark and Caroline. So the first question that we've had come in is for Caroline. So how does the ABS choose the questions that go on the census?
That sounds like a Dorothy Dixer to me, but yeah, that's a great question. Mark touched on that a little bit when we talked about the two new questions that we were able to include in the 2021 census, being the health and the veterans. Those two topics were chosen from about 450 submissions that we got from the public, businesses, government departments and other organisations. So lots of people want data in their area of interest to be collected on the census, and we start this process by having a public consultation and engagement with key data users. That's going to be happening very soon for the 2026 census. So if you're interested in influencing what questions will be asked on the next census, start thinking about that because next year in 2023 we'll start that public consultation process. And then we have to make really difficult decisions around what questions are able to be collected on the census. And we do a lot of testing, a lot of feasibility. Are they questions that people can actually understand and interpret and give an accurate answer to? Are they questions that maybe aren't too sensitive, they're acceptable, and can actually be gathered on the census? And then the role of the ABS is not actually to make the final decision on the questions that get asked. We put a recommendation to the government, and the government of the day has the fortune of deciding which questions go on the next census. But we do all the background research and work for them to put those recommendations to the government on what they can ask in the census. So yeah, plug for the consultation process for the next census starting early next year.
Wonderful. We do have plenty of other questions as well. So yeah, it wasn't. Anyway, so the next question is for Mark. Is the Indigenous increase in Victoria concentrated in Greater Melbourne or in regional areas?
That's a good question. And Caroline covered the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander component, so I'm not sure if you drilled into that more by region. Caroline can answer that. I think it's probably better coming from you.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, no worries. I did cover that, and we didn't present much on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people in Victoria. If you give me a moment, I have got a map that I'll refer to. So Beck, if you can ask Mark another question, I'm going to find out an answer and not make it up.
Excellent.
Sure. Well, this question is for Mark as it covers health, and I know you've talked about health today. So is the Victorian prevalence of asthma significantly different from other states? There has been a media reporting around Melbourne being an asthma hotspot.
Okay, so I have only at this stage looked at a state level, more at New South Wales. I'll have to dig into that question a bit to make sure that, again, yeah, we don't make things up in the ABS, so I'm not going to make anything up. But what I'm seeing in the asthma line compared to, say, the Australian similar thing for the Australian population, it's quite similar. So I'm not seeing, proportion-wise of the Victorian population, a significant difference, although it does seem to be just slightly higher in the Victorian population. I'll need to drill into the data a bit more to get the actual percentage out. But yeah, my quick assessment of that, if I compare a couple of the charts that we've pulled out, is that for Australia, it's more around the 8% mark, and for Victoria, it's a little bit higher than that, both under 10% though.
And we should be able to find a lot more information on that at lower levels using community profiles and quick stats on the website.
No, absolutely. So using those tools that Caroline's already covered, you can very quickly drill into that level of information for any region that you're interested in and compare it back very quickly to both the state total and Australian total, right within the same quick stats page.
Sure thing. Are you ready yet, Caroline, or do you need a bit more time?
No, I have found the map I was looking for, and it's not exactly the picture that I wanted to share, but what I have just pulled up in front of me is the proportion of people who identify as Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander by the SA3s, and I can see that the colour shading schemes that we were using earlier, there's virtually none throughout all of Melbourne and most of the south of Victoria. It's really when I get up to Mildura, what's that, Murray River, Swan Hill, and over in the east there, sorry, my clicker's a little bit slow, over in Gippsland, and one last place in Shepparton. So Shepparton's probably the region that has the highest proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. What that doesn't show, which I think is what the question asked, is how has that changed over the last 5 years, because I did talk about there being such a growth in the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander population. I know, I'm plugging the articles again, I know that our team in the subject matter experts in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander statistics have already put up some state profiles, and I'm sure that number is in there. So have a look again on our website, and maybe I'll make sure before the next seminar that I've got some of these numbers in my back pocket.
Wonderful. So back to health now, Mark. Is there data about long-term health conditions and cultural diversity, like if any cultural group is overrepresented in any health conditions?
There certainly is. You can certainly look that up and find different cultural groups based on all the cultural diversity indicators that Caroline was talking through. There's also ethnicity that we collect, like ancestry, I should say, that we collect on the census. So people, even in that group that is born in Australia and has parents born in Australia, people will have reported a range of ancestries through that. So you can look up that and cross-classify with health. But I'll just put a word of caution in there again, or at least understanding that age is a very significant factor in the long-term health conditions and looking at the results for long-term health conditions. So if you compare some of the older groups that are in Australia, and by that I mean, post-World War II migration, you have more Italians and Greeks in that European migration coming out. They will be generally older populations, higher median age, more people in those top end of that age pyramid, and you'll see more long-term health conditions as a result than, say, Nepalese or Indian people, or that where there's much higher groups coming out now, and the more recent Asian migration that we've seen, where you'll have much younger population groups and therefore much less long-term health conditions, but not necessarily anything to do with the cultural diversity. So just something that you really need to compare, say, all over 65s, or find another way to equalise the age factor in that to really get a deeper insight into what the data is telling you.
Wonderful. Caroline, can you please define private dwellings? Is this property owned by individuals, companies, trusts, or not owned by the government?
Okay, yeah, sorry, I did use a piece of jargon there. I should have explained that. By private dwellings, it's probably best defining it as what it's not. So it's not communal type accommodation. So we don't talk about private dwellings in terms of their ownership, but in terms of how people live within them. So if I contrast, for example, a hotel is a communal dwelling or a non-private dwelling. You don't have typically your own kitchen facility or your own bathroom facility. But if we look at private dwellings, they are more things like a house or apartments. And probably another interesting contrast to make is in the aged care sector, you will quite often see independent living type arrangements where people are living in an over 55s or another form of retirement village, and they are often in private dwellings because they've got their own dwelling within that, compared to when you get into a nursing home where it's more a communal type of accommodation. So sorry to use technical language there.
Thank you. Mark, thank you for sharing today. I am curious about homeless people, which I believe there are many. Can you tell me why the underprivileged people are not counted in the census, please?
Well, I'll say that we certainly do count homeless people in the census. We have a whole special strategy and work with service providers for homeless. So we certainly did have some challenges with that in the COVID space in the census part this time around, but that didn't mean we weren't able to count homeless people. We just had homeless people in some different situations in different states where there were different things going on at the time because of COVID. So we had to work very closely with state authorities and with service providers to make sure that we could get that count as effective as possible in the 2021 census. We don't release data, the specific data around homelessness until 2023, and that's one of those more complex ones that we take a bit of time to work through. And when we talk about the homeless community, there are different measures of homelessness. We generally refer to homeless as the people who are effectively sleeping on the street or sleeping rough, as it's sometimes referred to. And then there's people who are in temporary accommodations, and then there's people who are couch surfers, and they don't have a home of their own, but they're living in other places, and they are moving around and staying with friends, family, that sort of thing. So we do look at all of those levels of homelessness and count everyone in the census. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Caroline, an assumption to answer or to respond to. I assume that the median rent and the mortgage repayment amounts are the median of people who make these payments and not all Victorians.
Correct assumption.
Wonderful. And another one for you, Caroline. In language, how much percentage of Victorian population speak language other than English?
So I think I'm going to flick back through my slides. I think it was, oh, hang on, let me clarify the question. First of all, the question that we ask on the census is about main language other than English used at home. So it may be that someone does speak multiple languages, but they don't use another language at home, in which case they're mainly using English, and they're reporting that they are using English at home. So probably if we're looking at the number or the proportion of people who speak more languages, then it's more than the number I'm about to give you. And I'm still flicking through my slides so I get it right.
I believe you had there's nearly 70%, was it, in 2021 speaking English at home?
67.2%, yep. Yes, good memory. 67.2% speak only English at home, leaving the 30-odd% that predominantly use a language other than English at home.
Wonderful. I might start with you, Caroline, on the next question, but maybe we could pass to Mark if we need a little bit more assistance there. So what are the expected reasons for the increase in the population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in Victoria, the second highest across Australia? And then that's the question, and there's a little bit more information. So a higher than previously expected projected birth rate, more people identifying as Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander than previous censuses, or more people moving into Victoria from interstate, or people living longer?
Okay, I would say that person who's asked that question has quite a bit of insight into the data, and the suggestions made all contribute. We don't know the exact quantum yet of each of those contributors. We will be releasing a publication early next year that's called Understanding the Count, and that will dive into why has the count changed. And so if I look at it as at an Australia level, we said there the population of people reporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander has increased by 25%, and that was a higher rate in Victoria. It was 37.4%. So some of that is due to people who are identifying for the first time. So that number is not all reflecting changes in the population over time. It's how people are choosing to identify. Another component of that is quite often you're seeing people who are of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander origin marrying, having children with people who are not of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander origin, and their children are then most likely to be identifying as Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander. So that's contributing to the growth as well. There probably has been, or there could have been, some net movement, and that's what we'll see in our second release of data in October, where people have moved to and from, and whether any of that population who moved into Victoria are increasing the rates of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander. And the other part of it is, I think we have over time been getting better at ensuring participation of people from Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander backgrounds. So we put a lot of effort into making sure that people of those backgrounds, and not just Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander, but other groups that maybe sometimes have more challenges participating in the census, do participate. So that increase in people participating may also have contributed to that number being a bit higher. But Mark, I don't know if you want to add any more on that.
That was a very thorough answer, Caroline. I guess you alluded to the fact that there's more data that we release in second release that's required to do that full analysis. And so that's why the information doesn't come out until next year. We did do a similar study in 2016, but like you said, the person who asked the question might already know that from the understanding of the demographic factors that lead to this. But that study from the 2016 census released in early 2017, I think, did indeed identify that some, not most, but some of that increase between 2011 and 2016 was due to more people choosing to identify, and so when we look at that and we see that cohort change, it's really important for that decision making around understanding, well, what's the data from census to census telling us, and important to understand when we eventually get that understanding and can break that down a bit more to understand how has the cohort changed of who responded like this last time to this time, and how might that be influencing the overall results that we see for that population. And that's true for any population that you count at any time, but particularly true when you see these sorts of growth numbers and see that there is change in who's reported Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander.
Thank you. One for Mark. Is there any information about how many people do not speak English in Australia?
So we do have proficiency of English that we record in the census, or we ask for in the census, and I'm going to have to go a little bit on memory here because I don't have it in front of me, but I believe right across Australia the proportion of people who either don't speak English well or don't speak English at all is about 4% of the population. But if you look at the people who are speaking English at home, not speaking English at home, I should say. So that subpopulation who are speaking other languages, not English other than English at home, it's about 15% of that population who don't speak English well or at all. I don't have the breakdown of people who don't speak it at all, but I think it's useful to group in those who don't speak it well, because most people have some language skills, but that doesn't mean they can get around and communicate and do everything they need to do in their daily life. So I think using that not speaking it very well or at all, it helps. And so when you think about the large number of people who do speak languages other than English at home, and only 15% of that actually have an English barrier, they're unable to communicate in English in a useful way. That's a really important aspect of service population. But when you compare that to the whole population, it's very small, it's 4%. But that's not surprising, because a large number of people born in Australia, a large number of people speaking English at home.
Great. Caroline, what would be the approach for the next census for those who identify as LGBTQI+, as non-binary may not cover all?
Yeah, that is a good question. And for those who have been following the lead up to the 2021 census, you might be aware that we did spend quite a bit of time exploring possible topics around LGBTI. And I mentioned the consultation process that will start next year for 26, the 26 census. I expect that will include people making submissions about LGBTIQ. So what we did in the lead up to 2021 was we had heard from data users and the community that there was interest in not just collecting a question on sex, as we've always done in the census, but also collecting questions on gender identity or sexual orientation, or people who have variations of sex characteristics, because the term non-binary sex certainly doesn't cover sex diversity, let alone gender diversity. So we did quite a bit of testing around questions that we could ask on gender identity, and we've also been speaking with our international colleagues in the UK and also in Canada who did ask these questions in their census last year, and our colleagues in New Zealand will be asking it in their census, which is coming up next year. So we will continue to explore that ahead of the 2026 census. But it is worth pointing out that we do, in the ABS, not just run the census, we do run quite a number of other surveys, and we are increasingly including questions about gender identity, sexual orientation, and variations in sex characteristics in some of those surveys. And we'll see some reporting from that soon. So we've got some big surveys out currently, the National Health Survey and also a mental health survey that are asking these questions.
Thank you. The time series community profiles, when will they be released?
Very soon. I won't put a date on it. I will say it's in the next 2 weeks. I think they're just about done, and I think we're promising that by the end of July.
Wonderful. Why is some education and income data available now, but more will be available later, like in a second release?
It's probably about the complexity of the how we process the data. So the education data that is already available is whether you are currently attending school, attending an educational institution. So that's a fairly easy question to process. It's a simple tick box if you're attending a school or a tertiary institution. What comes later is what qualifications you have. What's your highest qualification? What field of study is your qualification in? And a lot of that, we capture the data by people writing in that they did a bachelor degree or they did a certificate 3. So it's, if I just make it simplify what I'm saying, it's not just a tick box answer, it's a fairly more detailed input, so it takes longer to actually do all the work around that. And it's the same sort of thing that we see with all the employment data. We ask people about their occupation and about their industry, their workplace address. Questions like that are sort of more complex. So that's why some things take a little bit longer, and we're working hard on preparing that data now for release in about three months' time.
Great. Second last question for both of you, actually. So we'll start with Mark. What surprises you about I'll start again. What surprised you or the census about the most, what surprise, I know what they're trying to say. What is the most surprising data available for Victoria in the census?
Oh, the most surprising data for Victoria specifically, I think, looking at going through and looking at some of the mental health results and that for the older populations, while it probably shouldn't have been surprising, I think just seeing that that potential impacts from COVID there and right across the population, that's probably the one that stood out for me in looking through this information. What else have I seen that was either interesting or surprising? The fact that maybe I'm stealing Caroline's here, but right across the country, we saw a big growth and emerging number of people who were born in India. So we've seen a large number of people coming from India to Australia. The fact that had a big influence on Victoria and took the top spot over the last 5 years as the number one country of birth outside of Australia. That was something that I noticed fairly early on in preparing and looking at census data, and thought that was a surprising result. Not for any particular reason, just that it's been the number one spot. England has been the number one spot there for a while, so it's quite a change. That's probably the best I had. Did I leave anything for you, Caroline?
Yes, I wasn't going to say that one. And I'm going to refer to a chart that we didn't present today, but I think, and hopefully it's not too sensitive to say, but there's often been commentary about when Melbourne is going to catch Sydney. And we did prepare a chart, which we haven't included, which shows that Melbourne isn't catching Sydney. So I think that's actually surprising when we looked at that data and the growth patterns in the greater Melbourne population versus the greater Sydney population. Over time, Sydney does keep growing, and it's not at as great a rate, but I guess my spoiler is Melbourne's certainly didn't catch Sydney in 2021, and it still looks to be a little way off. So that did surprise me, because I've been listening to the media that is leading me to believe that Melbourne's about to overtake Sydney any day now. And Martin didn't mention that one because he's from Sydney.
Yeah, I wouldn't be brave enough to mention that, but the gap is narrowing just very, very slowly, slower than people might have guessed. So, yep.
And the last question, I think we can get Caroline to answer this one. What other seminars are you running to explain census data in more detail?
Okay, yeah, good question. We are doing a lot of these. This one has been our first of the state-specific seminars. So we're doing this for every jurisdiction over the next few weeks. If you missed it, we did a national level seminar a couple of weeks ago now, and that's available on our website. But we will also be doing more detailed topic-based seminars. So we're going to be doing one on health in the coming weeks, probably sometime in late August, I expect. We'll also be doing one on the migrant or cultural diversity. And one that I'm looking forward to that we're not going to do until probably November is exploring more about service with the Australian Defence Force. We have released a really good article on that data already. But what we're going to do when we get more insights from the second release of data about migration, internal migration, occupation, industry, and so on, we're going to be doing a seminar focusing on services with the Australian Defence Force. I expect we haven't planned all our second release ones yet, but we'll be doing another national data seminar for second release. And I expect there'll probably be something about COVID impacts or something about labour force as well. But in the coming weeks, health and migrants are the couple that you can look forward to. Oops, and I should have said as well, sorry, we have already done a seminar on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That was last week, I think, and that's also available on our website.
I might just jump in quickly, Beck, and just add that Caroline took us through some of those key products, and I know a lot of people would have seen those, but don't wait for a seminar. Jump on our website, get in and search by topic or by region and have a look, because a lot of the questions that have been asked here that I didn't know off the top of my head, or that Caroline wasn't able to say off the top of her head, it really doesn't take long to jump in, search for something quickly and be able to do that comparison or check. So please come along to the seminars, don't get me wrong. You get to see some nice charts and other things, and we'll talk through the data. But there's a lot of power at your fingertips when you jump onto the website and just go straight in and start searching those really simple topics and really simple products to use. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And just a note for our audience, if your question hasn't been answered today or you think of more questions, you're always welcome to contact the client services area in the ABS, and they will funnel your question through to us. The email address there is client.services@abs.gov.au. I will close this session now, but I'd like to thank everyone who joined us online and who'll watch this in the future as it's being shown on the website. And I'd like to obviously extend my thanks to Mark and Caroline for an excellent presentation, and to all the other people who have helped make this session possible today. So thank you to everybody and have a great day.